Warcry 3rd edition. Is it coming? When is it coming? I don't know. Nobody knows. Some people say that it should be due around about next year if we're going for the 3-year cycle of Games Workshop releases that we seem to have recently. Personally, I'm in no hurry for a new edition. I think this edition of Warcry is doing pretty well. I like the direction it's going, and I like the updates that Games Workshop have been putting into it. So I'm in no rush. If it were up to me, I would see Warcry become more like Necromunda or more like Blood Bowl, where they basically have one proper rule set and then it receives periodic updates, new gangs, new themes, new areas that we would go into. That's what I want to see, but that's not what you're here for. Today I'm going to talk about what I think could be coming in a potential 3rd edition of Warcry. I've got 2 things that people generally agree on, and one thing right at the end that's super controversial that I know you guys are going to hate, but I think it'll be good for the game. So bear with me on this one. But before we get into that, if you like what you see, please don't forget to like and subscribe. And if you want to throw some more support my way, you can join me here on YouTube as a member. You can join me over on Patreon. You can join me over on Streamlabs. Either way, you will get to see stuff before anyone else gets to see it. You will get to see behind the scenes content, the stuff that I'm working on in the background, and you'll have a little bit of a say into the kind of topics that I look at next. But yeah, let's get into it. Let's talk about Warcry 3rd edition. So this bit is about faction passives, and I recorded it well before we had any idea about the battle traits that have literally just been released in the Briar and Bone set. You can see some of them behind me. I will be doing a video on them, but the long and the short of it is that either I can tell the future, or that Games Workshop have literally been watching me to see what I've been doing. They work basically in the same way as the faction passives I'm going to be talking about in this section. If you don't care about that, you can just go ahead and skip this section. But if you want to see a little bit into my thought process about why they should be added and what they're for, you can go ahead and watch this. I think it's interesting anyway, and I'm going to see you guys fairly soon with a video about the battle tactics themselves. Okay, so first up, I want to steal an idea that's already present in narrative, and that is faction passives. Now, I think the faction passives overall would be a pretty good thing for the game. It would give a little bit more depth into how each of the warbands play and what they do. And it's not like we don't already have a precedent that's been set for this in proper match play. The Pyegeists, they do have their passive Balefire creation. And when I say passive, an ability that's always on, an ability that your warband will get just for being that warband. Now, I did say it's already present in narrative. In narrative, we have things like the Tidal Raid rules for the Idoneth Deepkin. We have things like the Bad Moon rules for Gloomspite Gits. And what these rules do is it gives additional abilities to your warbands just for being your warbands. And it makes the choice of picking your warband a little bit more in depth and a little bit more interesting, because effectively what it will say is, okay, if you want to play this certain playstyle, you can pick this warband, or you can pick this warband. Maybe you like the idea of following the Bad Moon around and getting different buffs on different turns, or if you like the Idoneth Deepkin idea of having high tide, low tide, which will encourage certain playstyles depending on where you are in the game, you can pick a warband to do that. What this does for us is that it moves away from this kind of idea that we have at the moment, where you can basically pick any warband as a base within your Grand Alliance, and as long as the chaff are cheap enough, you can just ally in any of the allies that you want to take. This way, you'll be picking the base of your warband, 1 for the fighters that they'll have, and 2 for their faction passive that they bring to the table. Now, of course, we want to see some rules based around this. What I would do to kind of balance this is that only your main faction gets access to your faction passive. This means that any allies you bring in won't get access to your faction passive either, so you don't get to stack really powerful abilities, and they won't get access to their faction passives because they've been allied in. Additionally, what you could do, if Games Workshop wanted to further encourage people to bring everything within one faction, they could say, all right, as part of the faction passive, if all of your fighters belong to the same faction, you're going to get some additional bonus. And I feel that what this will do is it'll give a really interesting, almost dilemma to list building, where you'll have to think about the allies that you're bringing, and you have to think, okay, are the abilities and is this stat line worth it, the points that I'm paying? So not only do you bringing your ally stop that ally from using their faction passives or yours, but it will also remove the bonus ability that the rest of your warband might otherwise have. I think this is really interesting. I think this is a way to add a lot of flavor into the game and to give more tactical depth when you're actually picking your warband and while you're building it. Next up, I want to steal an idea from Age of Sigmar and 40k, really, because they've done it also. But I want to steal an idea from Spearhead. And my idea for this is that you're going to have the core rules of Warcry as they are today, and that'll be the main way basically to play. But I've been thinking about the bespoke boxes, and one of the main questions that gets asked is, if I pick a bespoke box and I pick another bespoke box, how will they fare against each other? Is it going to be a balanced play experience? And I feel like there's an opportunity here. I feel like there's an opportunity to get different formats going in Warcry, and really taking an idea from Spearhead, I think we can do something for that. And what are we going to do? One of the formats is basically going to be a pre-constructed format. And the idea is that if you're just starting the game, you can pick up any one of the boxes and they will be balanced against each other. Okay, guys, before I continue, I want to give a little bit of clarification into what I'm talking about here. I am not suggesting that Warcry moves into a Killteam style pre-constructed format. Games Workshop has an issue with balance, and they've got issues with balance of the bespoke boxes. And the reason for that is because each of the bespoke boxes, they have to add up to around about 1,000 points. And I think that's an issue for Games Workshop, because when people pick up these boxes, they expect them to be balanced versus other boxes, because it's the starter set, essentially. You pick up the box, you can play what's in that box versus what's in another box, and that's the expectation. But in reality, that's not how it goes. You've got boxes like Asigan True Blades, for example, which are realistically pretty weak. You've got Hunts of Huanji, which is realistically pretty weak, and you've got to do all sorts of things to that box to make a really good, solid, functioning 1,000 point warband out of it. So what I'm suggesting is that we do away with that completely, remove the link between the points cost of the fighters in the box and what the fighters in the box can do. We have it so that these boxes are balanced against each other. And then if you want to go into Warcry proper, or when you want to go into Warcry proper rather, you have an option for doing so, because you're going to have all of the points costs of all of those fighters anyway, just like a normal starter set, be it for 40k, for Age of Sigmar, Spearhead we're talking about here, whatever. It's just a starter set. Once you go into that game, you have to buy more boxes, you have to buy more stuff, basically. If you want to customize your warband, you can buy more things. If you want to bring more of different fighters, you can bring more of those fighters, and we go about it that way. So yeah, I'm very much not talking about moving into a Killteam playstyle. I know that's what it looks like, but hold your horses. What does this allow Games Workshop to do? They are allowed to remove points values from the boxes. We all know that the boxes themselves, they all but not really add up to 1,000 points or thereabouts. But what a pre-constructed format will allow is for Games Workshop to balance around the contents of the boxes and not the points cost of the stuff. And this can be like an evergreen format. If you're just getting into the game, you can play pre-constructed, and then you can go from there. And then what would pre-constructed format filter into? The full, proper, constructed game of Warcry, where if you wanted to spread your wings outside of that one box format, you can move into all of the list building, all of the allies, all of the thralls, and everything else that entails. But if you don't want that, and you just want to start the game, and you want a very simple game mode that you are pretty sure is going to be balanced against each other, you can stick with pre-constructed, play your bespoke warbands, and you should have an all-round good time. Now, Games Workshop can expand this out. They can say, okay, it's not just for the bespoke boxes. We're going to give a whole bunch of pre-constructed lists, again, in a very similar way to Spearhead or its 40k equivalent. Here's the list. Here's all the fighters in that list. Here's their abilities, and those lists are balanced against each other and all of the boxes. I think that's a really good idea. I think that's something that Games Workshop could do very easily. And not only would it help those people who just started to get into the game, but if Warcry had a couple of different formats and you're running events, you could have proper full Warcry as your main thing, and then you could have your pre-constructed format as like side pods or whatever in that. Or if you wanted to go the other way around, you could basically go the other way around, whichever way you wanted to do it. But my main idea here was really to make sure that Warcry itself is seen as a casual game by the majority of the community, and I didn't want to lose that, but I also wanted to remove some of those arguments saying that, oh, Warcry can't be played competitively or isn't competitive. Giving these different kinds of formats, I think, addresses that somewhat, because it allows not only the entry point, but also the final match play format that you'll want to move into if you want to really tailor your lists. Next up is an idea that I wanted to steal from Warhammer 40k. If you go onto their download site, you're going to see this. It's the Pariah Nexus Tournament Companion. And this is basically a list of stuff that tournament organizers can use to run their events. And what does it contain? It's got the mission sequence, so adjustments to the steps that players would take when playing in an event versus playing normally. And this would be stuff like, if we were to give a Warcry analogy, instead of drawing the cards, drawing your mission, your deployments, and your twist, it would replace all of that with the standard, okay, I roll for my side, roll for my setup, and then you follow the instructions on the mission pack. It can have stuff like that. It would have a full tournament errata, which would answer all of these weird questions in and around the missions themselves. But I think the most exciting thing that it would be able to offer is a full pack of match play missions that a tournament organizer could do. They could look at this pack of missions, they could pick, say, 4 or 5, however many missions they wanted, and they would be able to run an event that they knew at least that the missions themselves would be relatively balanced. These missions, of course, they would have to be built with match play in mind, and they would also have to be built to complement each other. The idea is, if it was, say, a pack of 20 missions, you could have a third of them objectives, a third of them kill, a third of them treasure, and then you could mix and match between them if you were the tournament organizer, and that's how you would come to the missions that you would run in your event. One other thing that I think is important and very interesting, this is something that 40k has, it's something that Killteam has. I don't know if Age of Sigmar has it, it's just been released, so it's quite possible in the General's Handbook, is a bunch of pre-designed terrain layouts. Because at the moment, if you're running an event and you want people to play competitive Warcry, you're basically going to put onto the table whichever terrain that you can get. You'll try and make it balanced. There's nothing concrete as to say, okay, this is the amount of terrain we expect you to have for a competitive game. I know Warhammer World, for example, they take something like 1.5 boxes worth of terrain, and that's what they use, but the majority of times they're putting terrain on the board to make it look cool and to make sure that there's a strong story and strong narrative theme that is running through their boards. Now, a tournament pack would essentially take that idea and say, okay, here are all of our set terrain layouts. This is how we recommend that you set out terrain to play our mission pack. And again, that terrain will be chosen specifically, and those layouts will be chosen specifically to try and give the most balanced experience possible to the people competing. And then finally, there would be a piece on placing and rankings. So in the main rulebook, for example, there are major wins, major losses, and minor losses. That's one way of doing it. There are also tournament packs. I'm thinking of the Nullwood pack, for example, that does a straight 5-3-1 win-loss-draw system, where if you win your game, you get 5 points, draw, you get 3 points, lose, you only get 1 point. This would basically clear all of that up and say, okay, if you're running your event, here's the amount of players that you would have, here's the scoring system, here's how you would sort people. And what that would do, it would effectively standardize competitive Warcry and really try to give it some of that legitimacy that I think is lacking at the moment, especially in the wider Warcry playing community. And finally, Killteam. Okay, I'm not suggesting that we turn Warcry into Killteam. Okay, I'm not suggesting that we basically pull that game system, slap an Age of Sigmar facade on it, and then go with that. I don't think that's where we want to go. I don't think that the community has any kind of appetite for pre-constructed warbands, especially in the tournament setting, because people love to list build, people love to play the warbands that they want to play, and it gives them that individuality and really gives them a bigger connection between themselves and the fighters that they're playing. But I do think that there are some lessons that can be learned from Killteam, and I do think that some of the mechanics could be ported over onto Warcry to try and address some of those questions that you get from more competitively minded players that basically say, okay, Warcry is just a game of dice, really. If you crit, if you don't, you lose. And if you ever watch any games of Warcry that I put up, we've seen that the game is really swingy depending on what your dice rolls end up being. What I would do is I would keep the ability mechanic. I think that's awesome. Keep the wild dice mechanic. I think that's awesome. Keep everything else about the game, but I would take a look at the combat mechanic to try and rein in some of that really swingy playstyle that you can get. Normally you don't, but if fighters like Vexmore, for example, are any kind of indication, if Vexmore goes big, he wins games for you. If he doesn't, he does nothing. So let's try and pull that in a bit, rein that in a bit, give a little bit more consistency, and also give, I think, a little bit more narrative flair to our conflicts, because that's something that Killteam actually does really well. When you start rolling dice and you get into combat and you start attacking your opponent, it's a lot more collaborative almost. It's, I'm going to do something, you're going to try and stop me from doing it, I'm going to parry your attacks, oh, I'm going to swing at you. It gives you the idea that combat is a thing that's happening and it's fluid, as opposed to combat being, I run into you, I hit you, and you die from it. That's really where I want to go. I want to try and port some of those combat mechanics over to Warcry to really bring some of that flavor into our combats. Now, for those of you guys who don't play Killteam, this is what your average Killteam datasheet looks like, and we're going to compare it to our Annihilator with Grandhammer. You'll see there are lots of very similar things. You've got an attack profile with attacks, a hit roll, and a damage profile with normal and critical damage. You've got a defensive block with how many defense dice you're going to roll. You've got saves, you've got wounds. We got a similar thing. Our defense dice and our saves are mashed in together to this one profile called toughness, and we similarly have a wound profile. Now you'll notice that because attacking is a lot more lethal in Warcry, stuff will have a lot more wounds. So one of the suggestions that I'm going to make is if we look at something like this, we trim those wounds down a little bit to try and bring everything in line and not just have it so that combats just last forever, which is something that we definitely don't want to have. Warcry as a game is supposed to be quick, it's supposed to be brutal, so we don't want massive protracted combats that go on for 2-3 turns. So the question is, how does combat work in Killteam? Here's the rules, but as a very quick overview, you're going to go into combat, you're going to roll your dice, your opponent is going to roll their dice, and then what you're going to be doing, starting with the guy who attacked, is he's going to be choosing what to do with his dice. So you choose what to do with your hits, your opponent chooses what to do with their hits. There are two things you can do. You can strike your opponent and do damage, or you can parry away opponent attacks. Which means that if you have something with a lot of attacks, with a very high weapon skill, so something that's going to be hitting very well, you have the choice. You can either say, okay, I'm going to use my attacks to try and kill my opponent very quickly, or I'm going to use my attacks to parry away my opponent's successes so that they don't have any dice to hit me back. And I think that's very interesting. I think that's something that could really work when we think about some of the different attack profiles in the game, right? So we do have fighters with lots of otherwise very weak attacks. I'm looking at you, elves. They really struggle because counter's a thing, and they're basically going to be taking a whole bunch of damage back. And even if they roll all their dice, normally they're not going to be hitting very well. Under this system, we'd have it so that elves would have a lot of attacks, as they do now, but then if they went in and attacked, they could use their attacks to parry away opponents' attacks and take less damage back than they otherwise would have if they had fewer attacks. So this is it. This is how the new melee attack action would work. This is basically if you took the Killteam mechanics, ported it into Warcry, but not as a direct port because Warcry has all sorts of weird little quirks with shooting and ranges and whatnot. You need to modify it a little bit, but this is basically what you would have. So let's go through this and let's really explain what's happening here. So first up, pick a weapon and target. Very simple. Choose a weapon you're fighting with. Choose a guy that you're fighting against. Exactly the same as Warcry. Pick any enemy fighter as long as they're within the maximum range of the weapon being used. So all the same. At the moment, that's exactly how it is in Warcry today. When we're talking about missile attack actions, we have the exact same rules. So far, so good. It's basically exactly the same for the attacking fighter. But where the difference is that once the attacking fighter has chosen what weapon they have and what weapon they are going to use, the defender then gets to pick one of their weapons, and then they get to roll their attack dice. You're going to be hitting in the exact same way as you hit now. So you'll look at your strength, you'll look at your opponent's toughness, you'll see what you need to miss, to hit, and critical hit. Once you roll your dice, you see how many attacks have missed, how many attacks have hit, how many attacks have critical hit, and then this is the main difference between Killteam and Warcry. Instead of just doing flat damage, you're going to be resolving your hits. Now, this is where your range comes in. So if you are the attacker, you will start and you will resolve your hits first. You get to either choose to strike, in which case you will do the damage to your opponent, or you get to parry, in which case you get to use one of your dice to remove one of your opponent's successes. And the idea is that you use your normal hits to get rid of their hits. You can use a critical hit to get rid of either one of their hits or their critical hits. Now, I was talking about range. If I'm attacking you with a spear and I have 2-inch range, but you only have a sword, you're not going to be able to attack me back. So if you're out of range and you are still the defending player, you only get to parry off your opponent's attacks. You don't get to attack them back. This makes things like spears, it makes things like flails extremely useful, because what it allows you to do is stay at range, attack your opponent, not get attacked back, but still have the opportunity to do damage to your opponents. Okay, so here I've got Skabic Plagueseeker versus a Putrid Blight King. Skabic has 4 attacks, hitting at strength 3 against the King's toughness 4, which means he's going to need to hit on 5s. The Blight King is looking at its strength 4, attacking against Skabic's toughness 4, meaning he's going to be hitting on 4s. Skabic's the attacker in this case, so he's going to roll his 4 dice, and he gets 1 crit and 1 hit. Next, the Blight King is going to roll. He gets 2 hits here with the double 5. What we're going to do is allocate the attacker's dice first. So the attacker here has rolled 1 crit and 1 hit. Skabic's going to allocate his crit first, which is going to do 4 damage. The Putrid Blight King is going to use 1 of his hits to parry off 1 of Skabic's hits, neutralizing that damage completely. And the Putrid Blight King's second hit is going to be doing 2 damage back to Skabic. But what about shooting, I hear you say? This is a little bit more complicated than just porting over a whole bunch of stuff from Killteam, because Killteam shooting is kind of weird, kind of fruity. In effect, I wanted to keep it as simple as possible. So what we'll be doing is using the same mechanics, but instead, the defender isn't going to be rolling their attacks, they'll be rolling their toughness. So it'll be toughness versus strength. If the toughness is greater, equal to, or lower, you'll miss, hit, and critical hit. You're always going to be rolling 3 dice, and you can only resolve successful hits. You're not going to be able to do damage back to your opponent. So what this effectively gives is these incredibly high toughness units. It will give them a really strong edge against some of these shooting units that would otherwise just blast them off the board. This does mean that we are going to need a rebalance in the amount of wounds that things have, because attacking suddenly becomes a lot less lethal. And it also means that we're going to have a rebalance in things like toughness, because we don't want to make the mistake of just basically making shooting completely redundant, despite the fact that Warcry is primarily a close combat orientated game. Okay, that is it from me for today. Thank you very much for watching. What do you think? What do you think about my various ideas for the next edition of Warcry? I think that at least 2 out of these have merit, but I'm not going to tell you which ones. That's something for you guys to figure out for yourself. As always, if you want to see more videos like this, or you just really like the stuff that I put out, please like and subscribe, and let me know down in the comment section below what you want to see in the next edition, any ideas that you might have, anything revolving around list building, revolving around allies, any rules you want to see added, any rules you want to see removed. That's always something that I would like to see. But yes, thank you very much for watching. As always, I've been Itan, this has been Musings, and we will see you next time.